About 230,000 people live in the lead-contaminated town of Kabwe, Zambia. This was home to the world's largest lead mine for 80 years and was part of the Anglo-American Mining Company Group from 1925 till 1974.
There were serious deficiencies in control of lead emissions, which resulted in widespread contamination of the environment. The public health disaster that has entailed the poisoning of generations of children in the local communities was entirely predictable.
When they left, as a result of their operations, they have left an environmental disaster. When you look at the Clark study in the 1970s and the blood lead levels then and to the blood levels now, nothing has changed. So the very same lead poisoning that was happening at that time is continuing happening now. Studies have shown that the soil in the township surrounding the mine has concentrations of lead more than 150 times higher than the relevant international standard of 400 milligrams per kilogram. Children are most at risk of lead poisoning because their brains and bodies are still developing.
The younger you are, the greater the risk. When a child is exposed in those early years, they can live their whole lives long with a damaged heart, damaged kidneys, and with impacts on the brain. And that cognitive loss is often permanent.
Lead in the blood is absorbed into the bones. During pregnancy, this lead is released. It crosses the placenta, causing harm to the unborn child. This is a serious risk for all girls and women of childbearing age in Kabwe. There is no safe level of lead in the body. Mental impairment can occur at levels as low as 5 micrograms per deciliter. Treatment is required at 45 micrograms per deciliter. Levels in excess of 100 micrograms per deciliter can be fatal. Various studies have shown that in some areas of Kabwe, all children under 7 have been found to have levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. Around 50% have levels greater than 45 micrograms per deciliter, and many have levels above 100 micrograms per deciliter.
At those levels, you could expect to see convulsions, coma, permanent muscular paralysis, and that child could die.
Anglo today subscribes to human rights principles. Unfortunately, Anglo's practices at Kabwe seem totally at odds with its public commitments.
Yes, thank you very much for this very kind introduction and invitation. And as said, I'm a pediatrician, and as a scientist, I of course need some slides, which you hopefully see very soon. The movie was excellent, and I will just give the scientific evidence to that movie. You will hear the same figures again. You will see similar pictures, but you know, you need to prove what's evident. You need scientific proof if you want to move forward. What I can say as a pediatrician, which I am, is whatever we do, if this is good for the health of children, we do a good thing. So if you keep in mind, whatever you do, yeah, in this case, if it's good for the health of the children, you did a good thing. Yeah, and we cannot undo what happened. We can just do something in the future. So you see the same picture of Kabwe. I had some help from John Jabe and Given Monga from the University of Zambia with this presentation. I want to thank them. Yeah, this is Africa, this is Zambia, this is Kabwe. The mining, you know, there's a historical picture of that mining site from the 1920s. That was the old processing plant, the old tailing hills, which you already saw. You will see this picture again because this is the point source. It's a polluted area, which I will explain. It's a hotspot of lead contamination, and you see the kids playing there in the area, the kids you saw before. So that's the area with about 200,000 inhabitants, many of them children. That's an interesting publication. It came out last year. We tried to look into the past. It's not from me, it's from another team. And it's very interesting. You know, if you think about trees, the tree rings go back into the past. So with the tree rings, you can say, okay, that was 25 years ago. So that's what they did. They analyzed tree rings for lead contamination. I tried to explain this slide. What's surrounded here is the lead and zinc production of that lead and zinc mine from the 1960s, where they got production data to the 1990s when the production stopped. And you can see in black, there was a lot of lead produced and zinc, and that peak was in the 1970s. This is the amount of lead in these tree rings if you go back in time. And you see there is lead in these tree rings. They cannot explain, Richard asked me before, this peak. I looked it up. They cannot explain this peak, but there is a peak. And that's very interesting. These are the lead isotopes. And lead isotopes, you know, depending on the source of lead, you have different isotopes. And this mixture of these two isotopes is very typical for the smelting. So they took a sample from the smelting place and from these tree rings. So it means that the lead in the tree rings comes from the smelter. And that goes back in time from the 1960s to nowadays. So that it's constant. So the exposure in the past was the company, and the exposure nowadays is due to the company's activities. So it's indicating a long-term lead pollution of the area associated with the production activities. That is the town of Kabwe from top to bottom. And you see in red the highly contaminated areas and in blue the less contaminated areas. So not all of those 200,000 inhabitants are contaminated the same way. This is the tailing hill, the former tailing hill. And what you see on the left side, according to the wind, is Makululu and Kasanda. These are the two townships which are mainly contaminated. And to the right, there's a canal going down. So these are the two main point sources or hotspots. Okay, on the left top, you see this tailing hill, which is still uncovered. Then you see, no, sorry, perfect. And then you see these dusty roads. So it's during the dry season, it's very dusty. So the lead dust blowing from the tailing hill into the townships, and you inhale and ingest this dust. And on the bottom, you see these kids running around there barefoot in this dust. So this is the pathway of exposure from the tailing hill to the dust to the kids. Why are children at risk? So why is this a problem? This is from WHO. Children's nervous systems are still developing. I will explain. And the young children have more hand-to-mouth activity. So they put this dust into their mouth and they ingest the dust and the body absorbs this dust. And children absorb more lead than adults. So there is about 4 times more dangerous to kids than for adults. This is a difficult slide. It just shows you there are many problems of lead in the body. We don't have to go through all of them, but you see from the brain to the stomach to the different systems. So the toxin is affecting different organs. And this is the recent publication from WHO from last year, How Dangerous is Lead? And we will just concentrate on the numbers we saw in the movie again, 40 to 50. So this is the area where you have, and you can't see it on the slide, I'm just telling you. So it's anemia or other clinical symptoms. So you can observe that the child has a lead-related health problem. For example, it has a strong and severe abdominal pains. And this is this 5 or 10 microgram per deciliter. This is where you can't see it at the kid, but you have to test the kid, for example, for the cognitive function. So these are the two areas where we are talking about action is needed. One is obvious symptoms, and one are symptoms which you can just examine, but you don't see them directly. So what are these typical symptoms? I'm maybe the only medical person, so I will not explain them all. So, but very typical are these abdominal pains. And what is the problem? What was shown in the video as well is that the brain is suffering. We call this encephalopathy. What can you observe? If a brain is damaged, you see, for example, seizures. So what is the problem of those two different things? If you stop the exposure, the abdominal pains will go back, reduce, and the child will recover. But if you damage a damaged brain will never fully recover again. So the problem is especially with these high lead levels that the damage done, let's say the damage was done in the 1970s and the person is now 50 years of age, that damage to the brain is still persisting. Whereas the acute exposure might cause some abdominal pains. If that kid moves to the capital, to Lusaka, these pains will fade over time because the exposure with or the contamination of the body with mercury is decreasing over time. The body is excreting the lead, but the effects remain. That's why it's so important, these different levels and the different problem they cause, and why lead is a silent toxin, why it's so difficult to observe. So this is the brain. We saw the brain before, but now we let the brain jump a bit. Let's say we observe somebody over time. So from conception to birth to adulthood, what is happening? And the lead exposure is varying over time. So sometimes you have more or less exposure. Let's say during pregnancy, during infancy, and so on, you have a different severity of exposure with lead. So this is crucial for the effects because our brain has different windows of susceptibility. So the brain is becoming better and better and better, and then with age, it's decreasing the function. And the IQ is developing over time. When is our IQ really developing? It's especially before we are born. The IQ is developed, so the cognitive functions. We still have some increase during infancy. In childhood, it's even less. And I'm not talking about us two old people here, what's happening to our IQ. This is not a very nice story. So when we take a blood lead level, let's say from the umbilical cord, it reflects the exposure just before being born. Let's say the last couple of months, you can see in the blood lead level. You cannot see the exposure over all of your life. So then we could say, okay, the blood lead level in the umbilical cord is high and the IQ of those kids in these townships are decreased. So that is an effect. But if you take the blood lead level, let's say of kids of 5 years of age, you can somehow connect it to the IQ, but you cannot connect it to what happened before. And in childhood, where you can do easily IQ tests, you have measured the blood lead level, but is there an association or not? Or does it only look like this? So this is, we have an effect that we can observe and we have an exposure that we can measure, but that's tricky, especially for you as legal people. This is not always at the same time. You measure the IQ today, you measure the blood lead level at the same time, but there seems to be an association, but it might be different and difficult. That was the most difficult slide. Now it gets a bit easier. So we look at this little kid, and this little kid is playing there. And what was said in the film as well, most kids have blood lead levels over 5, but even under 5, there is some negative consequence. We call it neurodevelopmental toxicity, which just means your brain is developing. And if there are toxic substances, it doesn't develop so well. What do we observe? Reduced cognitive and behavior, change in attention. So we can observe the skills, the behavior, and so on. They're all associated to these blood lead levels. And it's persisting, what I said already. It seems that there is no threshold for lead concentrations which can do neurotoxic effects. So the best would be 0, but it's difficult to achieve. So once again, we see these kids in Kabwe now. So I want to say a few words about Kabwe. These are just some results from multiple times. So from 2003 to 2012, these are older dates. And the higher the peak is, the higher the levels are. These are means of different children over different time. And it's difficult to say there is a trend going upwards or downwards over time. It depends on which kids you get to measure them. And as you can see, all these means from all these different townships are well above 5 micrograms per deciliter. So there's for sure a serious exposure of kids to lead. It was in the 2003 till nowadays, which you will see very soon. So 95% exceeded 5 micrograms per deciliter. What would your kids here in the UK have? 95% are below 5 micrograms per deciliter. Might be that even 95% of your kids are below 2 micrograms per deciliter. So this is really a very high exposure and lead levels. This is the actual recommendation. When should be something done or not? And what you can see is above 5 micrograms per deciliter, you should identify the source of lead exposure, which is clear for Kabwe, which is the source, and you should take action to reduce and terminate the exposure. So there is no doubt about what needs to be done. And what you see in red is therapy is recommended over 45. So if there are obvious symptoms, the child should be treated. So these are these 2 polluted townships, Kazanda and Makululo, and you see from 0 to 400 whatever microgram per deciliter, and you see more or less kids are exposed and have high lead levels. This is this red line, 45. So you see that a lot of children are above this 45. It's over 50% exceed 45. And on this blood, you see what action needs to be taken. And it was said that children can pass away over 100 micrograms per deciliter, and there for sure kids in the area have really by far too high lead levels. Okay, this is a more recent data. This is from 2017, published 2020. These are the current trends of blood lead levels. So you still see the kids over 45 micrograms per deciliter. Why is this lower now? Because it's not only the affected townships like Kasanda, Makululu, because it's what you see on the right side. There are green dots. Green dots are houses with low lead soil levels. Red and black dots are houses with high lead soil levels. So this sample was taken from the different areas. So the mean is lower. So it depends where you take a sample and how you interpret it. So this is, this is why medical science sometimes is so confusing. So this is the tailing hill, and you see right and left black and red dots, and more to the top, the lower green dots. And this is from the same sample, and this is Kabwe again, and you see, on the left side, it's much more red than on the right side. Why so? Because on the left side, you see the children aged 16 months, and on the right side, you see the adults. So this is what I said, children absorb much more lead. So this is one more study, and then I'm coming to the end. This is a study we performed. You see in the middle, the tailing hill, on the left side, Kasanda and Makululu. We did a cluster analysis, which is a bit different from just describing what's going on. So we see the cluster of high lead levels in Kasanda and Makululu, and the mean in the cluster is over 50 micrograms, and what we call cold spots, they have a mean level of 7 micrograms per deciliter in the area, remembering the level of 5. So even the cold areas have high lead levels. Okay, so we have the tailing hill, we have the dust, and we have the children running around, and we need some health intervention. So the different health centers are actually performing a health intervention, for example, treating the kids in the area. This is the final slide, and I'm starting off with a picture with water. Why do I mention water? You saw all the dust. So what would be best? To green the area. To green the area, you need to irrigate the area because you have 9 months of dry season. What's happening in Makululu, which is a big township? Water is privatized, so people don't have the money to pay to irrigate their backyards. So this problem is not just a medical problem. Large proportions of children are highly exposed and have high to extremely high blood lead levels. The individual lead exposure relates to the environmental contamination of the area caused by the old lead and zinc mining activities. According to threshold levels and international recommendation, children need to be treated. And most important is to reduce the exposure considerably and rehabilitate contaminated areas. This was a medical summary. Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself, your name, and how long you have lived in Kabwe.
Hi, my name is Barry Mulimba, Senior. I've lived in Kabwe, the provincial capital of central Zambia, for 46 years now. I domiciled in this town in 1976 when I was working for the Zambia Railways.
Could you tell us about your work with the community in Kabwe? How did you first get involved in the issue of lead pollution?
Now, before I answer that question, you may wish to know that after separation with Zambia Railways, I relocated to Chowa Mine Township in 1996. And I've been a resident of Chowa Mine Township for 26 years now. Following the closure of Kabwe Mine Township, a Kabwe Mine plant in 1994, the issue of lead pollution in Kabwe became so topical. And in February of 2005, my local authority, the Kabwe Municipal Council, with the town clerk then, Madam Vivian Chikoti, organized a training for community facilitators. I was fortunate. I happened to be amongst those that were picked to undergo training as a community facilitator through Chowa Health Center. Upon completion of my short course organized by the Kabwe Municipal Council, I developed a lot of interest in the issues related to lead pollution in Kabwe. Among the functions we were tasked to undertake in the community was to sensitize and bring awareness to the community of Kabwe regarding the effects of lead pollution. Some of the recommended interventions and measures to be taken by the households included, among other things, to advise the households so that they may adhere to the following simple recommendations. One, we used to sensitize the community to wash their hands with soap and running water, and to ensure that the children are bathed before they go to bed and their clothes changed, and to take off the shoes before entering the house. You may wish to know that shoes are carriers of lead-related particles. So that's how I found myself in the community as a community facilitator.
Okay. Can you explain the impact of lead pollution in Kabwe, how it is affecting the community and the environment?
The lead pollution in Kabwe is so huge and it's disastrous, especially among the young children. According to the experts, after training, I learned that lead is able to cause harm, especially to the young children. It has an effect, a serious impact on the health of the young people, especially the children, in that it causes anemia, it causes hearing loss, it causes even a death at the end of it all. So these are the very, very serious impacts on human life. When we come to environment, lead pollution results in plants to suffer reproduction. So these are some of the serious impact related to lead pollution.
Do you think the legal case is important?
Yes, the legal case is so important. It's important in the sense that the community in Kabwe would have not had an opportunity to take this case to court if the legal team had not come in. They wouldn't have had the opportunity to take the case to court because they do not have the resources and the expertise to pursue this case in a court of law. Before coming on board of the legal team, some members of the community never thought at any one time that they would have this chance or opportunity to be represented by a legal team, of course, at their own expense as at now. So I would say that the legal team has brought an opportunity for the community in Kabwe, who were voiceless at that time, to have their voices heard through the court, through the legal team in courts.
What would you like to see for the future in Kabwe?
What I would like to see for the future in Kabwe is that there is no recurrence of lead pollution in this town. And most importantly, the company that left the mess behind after the mining operations must be held responsible and be made to clean the environment, especially the source of the lead emissions into the community and the environment. I would like to see that the future generations in Kabwe do not become victims of lead pollution. And this can only be done if the source of lead emissions is addressed adequately and permanently. Additionally, the claimants who are on the program, should this case be determined in their favor by the courts, ought to be paid adequately, so that those that may fail to relocate out of Kabwe, they may go elsewhere where it's safe to buy houses or to build houses of their own.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
Yes. The lead pollution issue in Kabwe started a long time ago, and there was no awareness amongst the community. It's gratifying to note that upon coming on board of the legal team led by Leigh Day of UK and Mbosia Molede of South Africa, the community in Kabwe had hope and confidence that one day the case of lead pollution in Kabwe will be won and the victims shall receive compensation. Before that, the legal case would have not started because there was very little knowledge among the community in Kabwe regarding the effects of lead. Now that there is a legal team that has come to represent the victims, I hope at a later stage, although of course we are aware that the legal cases take quite long, but we believe that at one stage this case shall come to its logical conclusion. We wouldn't like to see the children of Kabwe be victims of lead pollution in the future, because children are the greatest asset the nation of every nation in the world invests in the future of the children. So it's our prayer that this lead situation will one day come to the end and the environment shall be thoroughly cleaned.
Oh, Mr. Mulimba, thank you so much.
I thank you.
Good morning, everyone. What I'd like to do is draw on some of the lessons from Kabwe for corporate accountability more widely. Now, wouldn't it be great if one of the key lessons that could be drawn is that, yes, it happened then, but it couldn't happen today, and it couldn't happen in future. Sadly, if we look at the contamination caused by mine tailings in so many parts of the world, that definitely isn't a lesson that we can draw. Now, Amnesty International is an intervener in this case because of the importance that we attach to addressing historical legacies. This isn't just about the rights of the victims of Kabwe and their families to a remedy, but it's also about preventing future abuses anywhere in the world, particularly on this scale. If companies aren't held accountable today for the harms caused by their past activities, then they have much less of an incentive to develop the business models, the strategies, the project plans that will avoid future harm. Now, if we want to understand where human rights figures in a company's business model and strategies, we only need to look at a company's strategic report, which is a requirement for all UK listed companies under the 2006 Companies Act. Now, the purpose of this report is to provide shareholders with information that is material to understanding the progress, development, and prospects of the company. So the question we might ask is, how material is human rights to Anglo-Americans' prospects? The answer lies in the part of the strategic report, and I'm referring here to the most recent one for 2021, that covers the company's principal risks and uncertainties. That's a key part of the strategic report, to show shareholders what the company's risks and uncertainties are and how the company is mitigating these. Now, Anglo, in its most recent report, identifies 13 risks. Legal liabilities arising from the impacts of their operations on the health or other rights of affected communities doesn't feature as a risk. Just by way of illustration, I'll very briefly mention all those 13 elements that do feature as principal risks for which the company has to develop mitigation strategies. Catastrophic and natural catastrophic risks, product price volatility, cybersecurity, political tensions and disputes, community and social relations, safety at work relating to employees and contractors, climate change, complying with regulations and permits, operational performance with regard to productivity, a pandemic, corruption, access to water, future demands for products from the company's metals and minerals. But the liabilities arising from the human rights impact of the company's operations on affected communities doesn't feature at all. Health and safety does feature, but only with regard to the safety at work of employees and contractors. The right to life, the right to health, the right to remedy arising from contamination are not issues that the company feels it has to address as a principal risk and uncertainty. These are not issues that are flagged to shareholders as sufficiently important to require action, and these are not issues that institutional investors are demanding that Anglo-American addresses. Now, as has been pointed out, Anglo does have a group-wide human rights policy, and this policy states explicitly that where we have caused or contributed to adverse human rights impacts, we will contribute to their remediation as appropriate. Well, the evidence seems overwhelming, as we've heard, that Anglo-American has caused and contributed to adverse human rights impacts through their Kabwe operations. But clearly the company isn't contributing to their remediation as appropriate. it would be appropriate for the company to provide compensation to the victims, to fund an effective blood screening program for children and pregnant women, and fund the cleanup of contamination of soil in the area where lead levels have been found to be many times higher than the internationally determined limit. So much for the company's human rights policy. Now, this failure of Anglo-American to conceptualize the human rights impacts of its operations as a business risk poses a challenge to us as human rights campaigners and also to lawyers representing victims of abuse. Now, the challenge for us is to actually create risk for companies so they do recognize their impacts on human rights as a risk that they have to deal with. And that is exactly what legal cases against companies that we're hearing about today, such as the Kabwe case, are attempting to do. These cases are all groundbreaking because they push at the very narrow boundaries of what companies consider to be threats to their business arising from their human rights impacts. Thanks to the work of Leigh Day and other law firms, these boundaries have moved over the last 25 years, but they've moved far too little and far too slowly. In light of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2011, endorsed by governments, by business associations, trade unions, and international NGOs, we might have expected these boundaries to have moved further and more quickly. But the obstacles faced by affected communities in obtaining access to justice remain considerable. Now, the lawyers here today are best placed to talk about the legal and jurisdictional obstacles, as Richard has done, but I'd like to refer to some of the other obstacles. Despite the development of global human rights standards for companies, there's still double standards, the North versus the South. There's certainly a striking contrast between the obstacles faced by communities in Nigeria and Zambia and other places to have contamination cleaned up, and the swift justice that was meted out to BP when it polluted the Gulf of Mexico and it was US citizens whose environment and livelihoods were affected. Most fundamentally, there's a lack of baseline information that affected communities can use to prove conclusively that the harm done to them was caused by a company's operations. Now, as we've heard, Anglo-American's medical experts dispute that there's any causal association between the company's activities and the harm suffered by individuals. Now, this denial of harm by a company and the high threshold required for victims to prove harm, it affects many communities around the world. Last week, 2 community activists from Peru visited the UK to share their testimonies of the harm done to their communities by Glencore's copper mining activities in Espinar in Cusco. The Espinar project has a long history of lawsuits filed by local people over contamination of the environment and its impact on health and on the community's way of life. Multiple studies on blood samples from local people and on drinking water have found high levels of lead, cadmium, arsenic, and other metals. This seems to be linked to increased illness in the area. But despite this, the government of Peru has failed to establish a causal relationship between mining operations and environmental contamination. Neither the state nor the mining company have taken responsibility for these health impacts, and their actions to mitigate them and treat people have been insufficient. Amnesty International recently found that the water in Espinar is not fit for human consumption. Even today, social and environmental impact assessments for mining projects all over the world often lack baseline indicators of levels of contamination of water, of soil, of air, indicators of the state of health of the community, indicators of how they gain their livelihoods, of the habitats of the animals they rely on for food, of access to resources such as water and forestation. And the problem is for mining affected communities that they usually lack the technological and sociological expertise to conduct their own impact assessments, which would require a multidisciplinary team working together. Mining companies have a monopoly of technical expertise at their disposal, including a number of global consultancies that specialize in social and environmental impact assessments. In most cases, companies aren't required to share their impact assessments with affected communities, or they do so too late for the communities to validate the information and use it in their favor. And how many states have regulatory systems, regulatory bodies that are in a position to assess hundreds or even thousands of pages of impact assessments at the outset of a project? And this isn't just a problem in the global south. Last week, I was at the AGM of an AIM-listed company called Beowulf Mining, which has received a license from the Swedish government to develop an iron ore mine in an area of the north of Sweden inhabited by the indigenous Sami people. The project is hugely contentious because of its potential impact on the Sami, whose communities and organizations have opposed the project since it was first announced over a decade ago. They believe that the mine would impose a direct impact on reindeer husbandry, on cultural practices, and on the transmission of indigenous knowledge and traditions to future generations. The Swedish government was unmoved by the representations made by UN special rapporteurs who expressed concern about the project. And the government was unmoved by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, who wrote to the Swedish government questioning the approvals process, with particular regard to Sweden's failure to seek the free, prior and informed consent of the Sami communities, which would be affected by the project. The point is here that even in Sweden, mining companies are given the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the granting of concessions for exploration and exploitation of natural resources. And that is the context in which the Kabwe class action is being pursued. Multiple failings on the part of the company to give effect to applicable international human rights standards and to its own standards, as we've seen from its statements, and multiple failings on the part of states to hold these companies accountable, in particular here, the government of Zambia. Also the UK government, given that Anglo-American parent company is UK registered. A positive outcome of this class action would provide the affected people of Kabwe with a remedy which could contribute towards the halting the cycle of harm which has persisted for generations. It would also break the cycle of impunity which encourages mining companies to pay little attention to human rights impacts at the outset of a project and to ignore legacy issues afterwards in the belief that they can get away with it as they have done. And it's because there's so much at stake for the people of Kabwe and more widely for the future of corporate accountability that Amnesty decided to intervene in this case by submitting an amicus brief to the High Court of South Africa, setting out why this case should be allowed to proceed, which we very much hope will happen. Thank you.